Hey, Optimancers, Chris here. So I was asked by patron of the channel, Eric H, to take a look at a video called Five Things I Hate About D&D 5th Edition. So this is a reaction video. I have not seen this video yet, but I'll start out by saying that creation content can be hard work. So I always like to suggest some appreciation to the original content creator. So I'll be posting a link to this video in the video description. If any of you want to go and, take a look and maybe give a thumbs up, that's always appreciated. So let's get started on this. I guess I want to start by saying I don't actually hate anything about D&D. I think there's lots that could be improved. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. But nothing I hate, but these titles often use hyperbole to try to catch viewers. So perhaps that's what's going on here. I know that, I have in my mind some things that I would definitely like to see changed in D&D, and I'm curious if this content creator goes by Tabletop Degenerate, if they have picked up on some of the same things that I have. I did get a little bit of an overview of what's in this video from Eric H, but kind of the topics, but not necessarily what exactly is said on each of those topics. So let's get into it.
It was summer of 2016 when I first started playing Dungeons & Dragons. Neither I nor any of my friends had ever played any kind of tabletop RPG before, but just as I graduated, I became addicted to a little show called Critical Role. Matt Mercer and the cast showed me the narrative potential of the game, as well as introduced me to the rules in a fun, engaging way and showed me just what it was all about. 6 years and hundreds of hours later, D&D has been a core hobby for me and my friends, and is the basis of some of our fondest memories together. And it's because of that extensive playtime that I've come to hate many aspects of this system. Now, up front, I want to say, obviously, that 5e is great in many ways. When 5th edition released, it brought something unique and valuable. It encourages creative roleplay. The system is great at stoking the imagination, and with extra supplements like the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, it's really welcoming to new DMs and players. It really helps a person get into a tabletop RPG without a lot of difficulty. But there's also a heaping truckload of dumb shit. Making feats an optional part of 5e is a game design tragedy. Perk selection is a cherished part of RPG history, allowing players to create characters that truly feel unique. For those unfamiliar, a perk is a situational, active or passive ability that a player chooses at varying levels of progression. Oftentimes, they have to choose one perk over a selection of others. Being presented with this choice between multiple options allows you to carve out a distinctive identity for your character or a unique role that they fill. In 5th edition, this kind of mechanic could have come in the form of feats. Instead, the designers made them optional. Even worse, they made it so that it's costly to take them. You actually have to hinder your character to do so. The only way to get a feat, if you embrace the optional rule, and if the DM doesn't add another homebrew rule as well on top of that, is to sacrifice ability score improvements to choose a feat. Raising your character's ability score in 5e is one of the key ways that your character grows stronger. In a system that already has glacially slow leveling, where many levels can go by before anything the player really looks forward to actually comes their way. But if you decide you want your rogue to be a hunter of evil mages because it ties into their backstory and identity really well, you have to forego one of the very few ability score improvements you get just to take the Mage Slayer feat. This punishes creativity. Aside from subclass choices, every character who shares a class is mechanically identical to all of the other characters, minus the items that they might receive. And the only way to further distinguish your character by choosing feats is to willingly sacrifice their own power and potentially put your character behind the difficulty curve of the rest of your party. Really lame. D&D 5e is a
Okay, so I'm going to comment on each of his points as he makes them. And there's actually multiple points he's making here. He says feats should not be optional. He says that feats, you shouldn't have to sacrifice an ability score increase to take a feat. He says that leveling is glacially slow, and he says that other than feats, there's no real way to differentiate your character from anyone else in the same class beyond subclasses and equipment. And I want to just kind of respectfully disagree with every single point. I'm not sure I agree with anything he said there. What I will say is that feats could be improved. There are problems with the feats and the way they are designed, and I'm hoping we will see improvements to that in future game design. But the points he's making, I disagree with. First off, should feats be optional? I think absolutely they should be optional, and that goes back to what he said in his introduction. He said that, he went at a table where he was playing with himself and his friends, and none of them have ever done role playing at all. This was brand new to them. Having feats optional makes the game far more an easy transition for a new player. Once you've gotten used to the game and you've gotten used to feats, I recommend using them. But if you are a new player and you have a new DM and you're trying to just figure out how to make characters and how to figure out how they work, I highly recommend you don't use feats. And this is why they're optional. Now, in terms of, he says, you also shouldn't have to give up an ability score. So he's suggesting that both feats be non-optional and not sacrifice ability score. So now you're really making it tough for a new player. Like, just imagine for a moment that you are playing D&D for the very first time. And you maybe start at level 3 and then you level up. And then your DM puts a bunch of textbooks in front of you and says you need to select a feat. You'll find them in the various spots in these books. There's, I don't know how many there are, but there's got to be more than 50 of them. Some of them are several paragraphs long, and you must select one. And no, you have no other option with that selection. I think that would be, if I was that player, I'd be not coming back. That would be the end of D&D for me. Part of the reason why D&D has brought in so many new players is because we don't do things like that to new players. And then later on, we can get into feats and get used to them. And in terms of giving up an ability score, I think there's a reasonable argument that maybe characters should get more ability score increases or feats. But he talked about perk selection. That is perk selection. I could take +2 in ability score, or I could take a feat. That's a selection. And you give up something to get something else. And character creation has that all over the place, and that's just one more place it happens to be. He suggests that feats are weaker than ability score increases, or that was the implication, and no optimizer would ever agree with that. I hate to say blanket statements like that. No optimizer I'm aware of would ever say that. Feats in general are considered more powerful than ability score increases. Ability score increases are kind of the backup if no feat applies. So I disagree with that point as well. And then he talked about glacially slow leveling. If you've ever played in a high-level game, you'll realize that D&D characters, the amount of power they gain over levels is quite dramatic. So I kind of disagree with him on all counts. I think feats are good for the game. I think I play with them, and I'm happy to play with them, and I recommend that experienced players should try them. But if you are a new player, you should probably stay away from them. But yeah, let's move on to the next point. I pretty much disagreed with that entire point.
D&D 5e is a specific rules system, except when it isn't, and you have to change everything constantly. How many DMs run the game, rules as written? If you spend time reading any Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition forum, you will know the answer is practically 0. Fans of 5e often herald the system's open-ended flexibility as one of its greatest strengths. Don't like something? Just homebrew it. But there comes a point when so many rules need to be homebrewed that it begs the question, why are we using this system at all? It's the old philosophical question, if you keep swapping parts out of a car, how long is it before it's no longer the car you started with? Now obviously, every system is going to have a good homebrew rule or two because every group is different. Rules you might decide on at your table may fit the kind of game you want to play, and that's normal and welcome. But it often feels 5e homebrews have to serve as large fundamental changes to the game's mechanics just to reach a baseline playability. Here are some rules in 5th edition the DMs change very often. Critically successful attacks, when you roll a natural 20, tell you that you should simply roll twice the number of dice that your weapon or spell attack would normally roll, and then add your modifier on top of it as usual. You know what sucks? When you roll 2 1s on those dice, and you end up doing 6 damage with your longsword critical. Crit rules are often homebrewed faster than you can say dead goblin. Speaking of death rules suck. When you go unconscious in D&D, you start making death saving throws. If you roll 3 successes, your character stabilizes and stops actively dying. If you roll 3 failures, you're in the dirt. But the rules state that if you are brought up with any form of healing magic whatsoever, all of your death saving throw failures go away. So if your party just packs a bunch of healing magic and clerics, the game just turns into an endless series of
Okay, I like this.
Consequently, many DMs change it so that players keep their death saving throw failures even once brought back to consciousness, so that there's actually a degree of pressure to not continue eating hits to the face. If you're nearing 0 HP, you should probably take a step back. Fall damage increases by 1d6 for every 10 feet your character falls, and is capped at 10d6. At most, your character can take 60 damage, and that is very unlikely, even in that case. The common argument for why this is the case for terminal velocity, the maximum speed attainable by an object as it falls through the air. The problem is that this is a fantasy game, and when a character has over 60 hit points, which you will have once you hit the halfway point of the game, you can fall 1,000 feet and live. Terminal velocity doesn't stop people from turning into paste when they fall great distances in real life, and no amount of adventuring experience should change that, even in a fantasy world. There are many other little things that 5e DMs are constantly homebrewing to make the rules feel copacetic with what players and DMs would expect to happen. The point is, if a system requires this much fine-tuning and constant adjustment to feel valid, why are we paying for the books and the website subscriptions necessary to play it? High-level play is untenable.
Okay. All right. So let me just go back a sec. All right. So his suggestion there is that D&D requires a whole bunch of homebrew in order to work. You use so much homebrew. He uses an analogy of changing all the parts in a car until it's not the original car at all anymore. And then he gave a few examples of cases where there is common homebrew. So I'll start by saying when he talked about his 3 examples, I certainly understand. Yeah, so critical hits, they do feel bad. If you roll terribly on the critical hit, it doesn't feel like a critical hit. And the yo-yo effect of you go down and somebody heals you and you get back up, and then you go down again and then somebody heals you and you go back up. That's pretty silly. I mean, people have talked about that for a long time. And yeah, there is a fair amount of homebrew in order to do things with that. And then he talked about falling. Now, I should correct him. The limit on falling damage dice is not 10d6. It is twice that amount. So 20d6 is the actual maximum fall damage. But he's suggesting the main point he's making is still valid, is that, you know, if you're a high enough level, you can pretty much fall from any distance and be confident of survival. So, yeah, I mean, all 3 of those are valid points about ways the rules aren't perfect. Do they all require fixing? Because that's kind of his implication, is that we require fixing all these things. And that I disagree with. I play with all those rules as written, and it's just fine. And I play all the time with many different people, and I don't think any of them homebrew any of those things. But I'll agree that lots of people do. The thing about homebrew is, you know, some people like to use a lot of it. Friend of the channel, Dungeon Coach, loves homebrew. So he does a ton of it, and he plays with it, and he loves it. And that's his preference. So it's not a bad thing that he does that. I usually use, in my preference, is 3 house rules. So I have 3 house rules. That's hardly changing the entire dynamic. Like that's the same car. That's the same car with 3 enhancements. And yeah, this idea that you have to change all these things. I mean, I played in games where we don't use homebrew at all, and it's fine. It works fine. The thing is of all his suggestions, they're all things that could use tweaking, but none of them require tweaking. And that's his suggestion here, is that you have to change all this stuff. You don't have to change this stuff. People are playing with the rules pretty much as they're written right now, and have been for years and years, and it's just fine. The amount of homebrew, D&D is a good game for, there's lots of opportunities for homebrew. It doesn't usually mess things up too bad. If you like homebrew, D&D is a good system for you. But if you don't like homebrew, D&D still works. So I disagree with his overall point that, you have to use homebrew. You don't. D&D works without it.
High-level play is untenable, and challenge ratings are a joke. This is a complex topic that is difficult to give a lot of concrete examples for, but anyone who's played high-level D&D 5th edition knows how off-the-wall insane things start to get. DMs in particular know how difficult it becomes to balance high-level play, because certain class features combined with the treasure trove of magic items high-level characters are likely to have makes it almost inevitable the DMs are either going to have to start secretly lowering or raising monster HP, or, in the worst case, fudging their dice rolls so they don't accidentally kill their players with overtuned encounters. A good example of this problem is the Rakshasa. It's a challenge rating 13 fiend. What makes the Rakshasa unique is that it is completely immune to all spells 5th level or lower. It is not affected by spells unless they are 6th level or higher. Okay, so it's challenge rating 13. What happens if your entire party is mages, magic users? All of them cast spells. What if that's their only real way of dealing damage? If that's the case, this thing's challenge rating might as well be 1 billion. Meanwhile, if your party is entirely composed of martial, physical characters who don't rely on spells for anything, then it's much easier than challenge rating 13. But none of these things are explained in the Rakshasa's information. As a DM, you just kind of have to know that through experience. So if you're new to the game and you look at this creature and think, that'll be a good challenge for my players, you may very well be wrong, because the system does not make it clear one way or another. It's often said because of these issues that the best Dungeons & Dragons 5e happens in the first 10 levels of the game. And that's definitely true in my experience, but I also think that's pretty disappointing. Multiclassing is another...
Okay, so I suspect a lot of you will know some of the things I'm going to say here, because I recently released a 20th level one-shot with the Dungeon Dudes and Colby from D4 Deep Dive and Eric from Fry Minis. We played, by the way, without homebrew and at 20th level, and it went just fine. And then I released another video where I talked about ways to make sure your high-level game goes okay. And these were tips for DM. Maybe I'll link it up above here. Because some of the things that are mentioned in this video, I actually totally agree with. He talks about, there's kind of landmines. If you are inexperienced and you're playing high level, there are things that are going to make it very difficult. And, there's potential traps for you. And that's true. I mean, the reality is if you are a DM and you're doing higher level games, in fact, if you're a player and you're doing higher level games, it is more advanced. There are more rules you need to keep track of. There's more possible scenarios that you need to keep track of. You can't possibly keep track of everything every character in your group can do once they're high level. I mean, the players themselves have enough trouble keeping track of that. But on the other hand, it is absolutely playable. 100% playable. He says it's untenable. That's not true. And I think that's objectively not true. He says challenge ratings are a joke. That's true. Challenge ratings are terrible. And I certainly hope they improve them. Because what I've found is rather than relying on challenge ratings, I rely on them kind of as a rough guide. But far more, I read the monster. And, because I'm experienced in the game, I have a pretty good idea of how challenging it's going to be. And when I read something like Magic Immunity, I'll read it before I throw that monster at the players. Now, I would say that a group of all mages where nobody uses a weapon is pretty rare. But nevertheless, DM should probably read the monsters beforehand. But the way I look at it is this: D&D, you go from levels 1 through 20, and those lower levels, that's easy mode. Not easy in terms of challenge for the players, but easy in terms of challenge for comprehending and using the rules. And then the higher levels are more advanced mode. So if you are inexperienced and starting in high level play, that is probably a mistake. You should start in low level play. Get the basis of the rules first and then play the advanced stuff later. But I'll say that now that I am experienced and I play with experienced players, we like the high level play probably more than the low level play. So this idea that level 1 through 10 is better, it's probably better for some groups, especially groups where people don't have a strong mastery of the rules. But later on, I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that high level play can be just as entertaining and rewarding, and maybe even more so. So I have to disagree on that point.
Multiclassing is another element of 5th edition that makes the player feel punished for wanting to do something creative. Let's say you're playing a 3rd level monk. You just chose your subclass or your monastic tradition, and your character is seeming more and more, narratively, like someone who is really into their religion, the worship of a particular god, and you think it would be really cool if your monk was also partially a cleric who had some spell-casting abilities in the divine realm of the arcane. So you dig open the rules in 5th edition for multiclassing, and you decide, yeah, you're gonna dip into cleric. Okay. So you reach level 4. You gain 1 level in cleric. You gain their starting cantrips, and the first couple of first level spell slots that they have access to. A couple of small class features from the cleric as well. Now, your character is level 4, but it's 3 levels of monk and 1 level of cleric. Were you looking forward to that 4th level ability score increase? You have to wait 1 more level for that now. That extra attack you get as a 5th level monk is also delayed by 1 level. In fact, everything you will ever get as a monk is now delayed by 1 level. So when your friends are getting their ability score increases and their extra attacks, you're getting some cantrips and 1st level spells. Maybe a good class feature or 2. Probably not as good as having 2 attacks. And that's just if you only take 1 level of cleric. The more levels of cleric you take, the further behind your monk is. This is the problem with D&D 5e multiclassing. Dipping into other classes siphons progress away from the initial class you chose. You can't just take a quick dalliance
and it gives you progress
into
in
other
a different
classes.
class.
You have to fully commit and lose progress on your main one. There are some undeniably useful multiclassing options. Taking a level in Barbarian will give you a Rage. Taking a level in Warlock Hexblade will let charisma-based casters use melee weapons very effectively. Outside of those exceptions, though, most multi-class pairings are just objectively worse versions compared to the main class you could have played. Not groovy. Okay, on to the last one.
Oh, well, okay, so, wow. So the end of that, really, I have to just kind of recollect here. Okay. I, again, have to respectfully disagree with his opinion. Very, very, very strongly. So the first thing he talks about is that, I got to go at the last first. He says, multiclassing, unless you're taking a level in Barbarian or a level in Hexblade, is almost always objectively worse than going straight classed. No, that's not the case. So check out, my builds are optimized, but don't just check me out. Check out all the optimizers. They're all multiclassing. And it's not just a Barbarian dip and a Hexblade dip. There's all kinds of multiclassing that's incredibly powerful. Good enough that it is significantly better than going straight class. So, if anything, my issue with multiclassing is it's too good. Like, it needs to be scaled down into some degree, especially with moving towards proficiency bonus per long rest features. if anything, it's the other way around. But I want to actually go back to his example because I really think he's missing the boat here because he talks about taking a monk. And I'm not going to talk about monks here. I'm just going to talk about his example. So you take monk, level 1, level 2, level 3. Then you decide that, I'd like to have a little bit of cleric spells because I'm thinking I would like to dally in cleric. And then he says, and then you're forced to take a whole level in cleric and put all your monk stuff behind. And you give up that ability score increase you could have otherwise gotten. So, first off, if you take a level of cleric, so you've got, cantrips, you've got first level spells and spell slots, and a divine domain with a divine domain power. Some of them are really good. I would say in many cases that is going to be significantly better than an ability score increase. But he talks about how it puts all your monk stuff behind. Yeah, but it also puts all the cleric stuff closer, right? Once again, I get the sense that he doesn't want to ever give anything up to get something else. Like give me my feats, but also let me increase my ability scores. Give me the abilities of other classes, but don't have me give up anything for my current class. That's not how it works. The way that if we're selecting goodies, the idea is that you get a selection of goodies and you get to pick, and you don't get to pick them all. So if you have option A and option B, you don't get to say, I want them both, and give them all to me without any penalties whatsoever. Otherwise, then that would have to be what you have to do. Everyone would multi-class every class and get everything. You're giving something up to get something else. And yeah, you are giving something up. When everyone else gets extra attack and you don't because you multi-classed, you miss it. You're like, oh, I got to wait another level to get that extra attack. But you got these other things, and that's why you did it. At least from a mechanical standpoint. Probably role-playing reasons as well, or potentially. But the other thing is he's actually objectively wrong about what he wants to have and what he has to do to get it. Because he says that, you go monk 1, 2, 3, and then he said, and then you decide that you want to kind of dally in cleric, because you would like some cleric spells. So therefore you have to multi-class into cleric. No, you don't. As he just said, you get an ability score increase at level 4. What if you took Magic Initiate Cleric? You could have some cleric spells, and you don't put any of your other monk stuff behind. So, that's actually just objectively wrong. He's making a claim here that's false.
Okay, on to the last one. Ah, yes, of course. Jeremy Crawford can go f*** himself. If you're a new player, you might not know who that is. Jeremy Crawford is...
All right, I'm just going to jump in for a sec here. So I disagree already with what's been said here. I think that Jeremy Crawford is fair game for criticism, but, it shouldn't be personal. If you don't like some of the rulings he's made, I don't like some of the rulings he's made. If you don't like some of the way he puts things, I noticed sometimes he'll make a mistake, or I think he's made a mistake, and then he'll kind of cover it up and suggest it was like intended the entire time. I'm not a big fan of that. But as far as Jeremy Crawford, the person, I have no reason to believe he's not a lovely guy and a smart guy. It just, I reserve the right to criticize game design because I'm playing the game and I'm a customer of the game. But yeah, I'm not big on the, letting him have it in a personal way.
Is one of Dungeons & Dragons 5e's lead designers. And based on what I've talked about in this video, I don't think he's very good at his job. The rules of 5e are notoriously ambiguous, so people started asking Jeremy Crawford for rulings through his Twitter. Jeremy Crawford makes rulings on the spot, and never once does he own up to how poorly worded or vague the original rules are. There's never any accountability or admittance that things could have been done better. Instead, he either just doesn't acknowledge or address the fact that he has to do this so much, or he blames you for not reading it carefully enough.
Okay, so I have decided not to show the rest of the video because there are a number of what I felt were personal attacks against Jeremy Crawford, and I don't want to give those a platform. But what I do want to do is kind of go over the point he's making, because he talks about an event where it sounds like this was the breaking point that made him leave D&D, because when he finishes that, he says, so therefore I no longer play D&D. And basically what happened is he was playing a bard, and he got to the level where he could get 7th level spells, and he took the Force Cage spell, which is a great spell. And then apparently it came up in game where a Disintegrate was used against the Force Cage, and he had an argument with his DM about whether Force Cage is destroyed by the Disintegrate spell. And obviously they must have looked up online to see if Jeremy Crawford had commented on that. And he had. So this is what Jeremy Crawford had to say. Disintegrate can destroy something made of magical force. Force Cage is described in its first sentence as composed of magical force. So then obviously his DM had used this as a reason why Disintegrate would work against the Force Cage. And he was very upset by this because he felt that Jeremy Crawford had made up the part about Disintegrate can destroy something made of magical force. He said that appears, in fact, I'll let him say it himself here.
Disintegrate can destroy something made of magical force. Force Cage is described in its first sentence as composed of magical force. Oh, good. So not only does Jeremy make a blanket statement about the Disintegrate spell that is not repeated in any official published D&D material anywhere.
So does it appear nowhere in the rules that Disintegrate can destroy something made of magical force? Well, here is the Disintegrate spell, and it says, this spell automatically disintegrates a larger, smaller, non-magical object or a creation of magical force. So Force Cage says it's a creation of magical force. Disintegrate says it destroys a creation of magical force. So Disintegrate should work unless something specifically says otherwise. Now he points out the precedent because he says, but Autoluke's Resilient Sphere says Disintegrate works, and Wall of Force says Disintegrate works, and Force Cage doesn't specifically say Disintegrate works. And you know what? I get why that would cause confusion. They probably shouldn't have bothered saying that under Autoluke's Resilient Sphere or under Wall of Force, because the Disintegrate spell itself says it works against those things. But then again, there might be a reason why. And it really comes down to actually the first line of Disintegrate, which says, a thin green ray springs from your pointing finger to a target that you can see within range. And there's one thing that Autoluke's Resilient Sphere and Wall of Force and Force Cage all have in common, is that they are invisible. So if you're targeting something like a Bigby's hand with a Disintegrate, then obviously it works. But if you're targeting something that's invisible, do you need to see it? And according to the rules, you do. And if you can't see a Force Cage, then you wouldn't be able to use Disintegrate on it. Except that Wall of Force and Autoluke's Resilient Sphere specifically say Disintegrate will destroy it. So maybe you don't need to see those. But I would suspect you do need to see a Force Cage, and there's ways that could be done. You see Invisibility Spell, True Sight. So there could be a reasonable argument that Disintegrate shouldn't work on a Force Cage in some circumstances. But his claim here that Jeremy Crawford made up the portion about Disintegrate destroying creations of magical force isn't true. And then he claims that this is condescending of Jeremy Crawford because he's suggesting he didn't read the rule. But I wonder, did you read the rule? Did you read Disintegrate and read the part that it destroys a creation of magical force? Because you just claimed it wasn't in there, and that it was nowhere in the rules. So, you know, if he was suggesting he didn't read it, maybe he has a point. So I want to finish off by saying, though, if you're not happy playing D&D, and, you know, disagreements with DMs happen, and sometimes those might turn you off a game, that's perfectly valid, even if you were technically incorrect. Your feelings are still valid, and if you're feeling like you're not having fun, and you're having fun playing something else instead, then good on you. That's what you should do. But in terms of these 5 points, I didn't find any of them particularly compelling. And the thing is I go online all the time and see criticism about D&D that I find totally compelling. These were not 5 cases of that. So yeah, tell me below what you hate about D&D, or things you think should be improved, or what you thought of this video. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.